We have Mr. David Manning, who is the Alberta representative. That's by far the largest energy province in Canada. David is the Alberta representative at the Embassy of Canada. And then Hector Castro Vizcarra. He is the newly appointed Minister of Energy Affairs at the Embassy of Mexico. Then, David, why don't you start with your opening remarks, please?
Sure. Thank you. My task this morning is actually quite simple because the Canadian piece, which you will find outside the door, is excellent. And I want to commend Christian and his team because it is not only accurate on the Canada, U.S. or North American energy relationship, it's also succinct. It is literally a 10 to 15 minute read, and it's quite manageable. So I'm going to I won't assume that you've read it, but I will commend it to you. Alberta, I represent the province of Alberta, which is the vast majority of the hydrocarbon resources in Canada. We do have Tim here from Quebec. Tim is at the back. Quebec has over 40,000 megawatts of hydropower. 60% of the rain that falls in North America falls in Northern Ontario and Quebec. So it is just a massive, massive renewables opportunity. So the Canada-U.S. relationship is not complete unless you understand that we have these enormous renewable resources and these enormous hydrocarbon resources. Alberta maintains an office here in D.C. and Liam Stone. Liam, if you could just wave for a second. Liam and I work here in D.C., and so if you have any questions, you can certainly approach either one of us. I think what's important to note, particularly in the background of what's going on in the world at the moment, is that we're now Alberta, well, Canada, majority is Alberta, is now over 33%. We're now over a third of U.S. oil imports. So while you watch the statistic where oil imports to the U.S. have declined from a high of about 65% now into the low 40s and heading down, trending lower, what's significant is that we now, Canada now, represents certainly as much as all the OPEC nations. So it's a massive story. So of course that involves the whole question of infrastructure and how we serve those markets. And Canada now has been a bit frustrated, as you can see, because of the Keystone Pipeline debate. So the real strategy for Canada is to move to export. So there are projects which go west. You're aware of those. I mean, this is a pipeline across the Canadian Rockies. One of them exists now, which would be expanded. Another one would be a greenfield project. A massive project would be converting some of the existing natural gas infrastructure. You know, when I first came down here, Ramon, it was to help support a pipeline all the way from Alberta to New York. Took 6 years to get it done. Tremendous opposition from the industry. And Ramon and I actually had that conversation. We're friends from past lives when he was at PDVSA. And so now, of course, we have a massive gas pipeline to the Marcellus Shale. Isn't that a good idea? So converting some of that infrastructure to oil to ultimately serve those refineries in eastern Canada and perhaps export is important because Canada imports 600,000 barrels a day in the East Coast. So there's a great opportunity, however, because as you hear about the export oil debate and the fact that we have all this oil in the Bakken, and some of my friends here in Washington say, well, why do we need to get so fussed up about Alberta? We have so much oil. Well, there's a lot of different kinds of oil, as you well know, and the heavier oils are coming from Venezuela, Alberta, Canada, and Mexico. And those are the oils that are needed in the U.S. The big refineries are built to take heavy. And what's coming out of the Bakken, what's coming out of West Texas is very, very light. And that's why you've now seen that, if you're watching this very closely, condensate has now been permitted to be exported. That's the lightest of the oils. So the U.S. is awash in light oil, and many of the refineries in some parts of the country need that. But the big refineries on the Gulf Coast, 40% of the world's capacity to refine heavy oil is in the U.S. Gulf Coast. It's getting there now on rail. So while the pipeline debate has gotten a lot of noise, there's been tremendous pipeline infrastructure built other than Keystone, and the Keystone volumes are now moving because we now have over 1 million barrels a day of capacity on trains. Well, that's kind of the snapshot of what's going on, but I welcome the discussion.
Hector?
Good morning. First of all, I want to thank the Council of the Americas for the invitation, as well as the IDB for the hospitality. When Christian first invited me to this panel, the first thing we talked about was the title, North America Energy Integration. I think a year ago, Mexico wouldn't be part of that equation. But since President Peña Nieto took office, and what has been happening is a game changer. In order to talk about, and one of the examples is the reason I'm here. This representation disappeared 10 years ago, and now is reestablished since last June because of the importance for this administration in this sector, what is happening, and what we expect to happen. So in order to discuss policies that coordinate or integrate North America region, I think first we have to bear in mind was the change of policies in Mexico. Since 1938, after the nationalization of the industry, well, we had a monopoly regime of Pemex and CFE. And Mexico had the highest production rate in 2004. We had 3.5 million barrels per day. And since that day to today, the investment has increased from $8.8 billion to $21 billion. But the fact is that the production has increased 1 million barrels per day. Now, in gas, what's happening in gas? The demand has increased, but the production has decreased. And we're importing 30% of the national consumption. In gasoline, we're importing 49% of the consumption. Now, these three facts, the irony of these three facts, is that we do have the natural resources, but due to the lack of investment, technology, and the legal framework that forbids private investment, we have to import. And the rates of the electricity is 25% more expensive than the ones in the United States. And if we contemplate the subsidies, because we don't, it's 73% more expensive. Talking about natural resources, not only proved oil and natural gas, but unconventional sources. According to the EIA, Mexico is the sixth country in shale oil and the eighth country in shale oil. So, due to this scenario, President Peña Nieto presented last December the constitutional reform that it was passed last December. But I want to emphasize that we cannot see this as an isolated issue. We have to see it as a transversal policy strategy with the labor reform, telecommunication reform, tax reform, transparency reform, political reform, etc. If I have to sum up the energy reform, and I think I do because of the time, it will be the following 5 points. 1, Mexico will continue to be the sole owner of the hydrocarbons in the subsoil. 2, free competition with state and private enterprise on upstream, midstream, downstream, and commercialization, as well as the electric industry to benefit the consumers. 3, strengthening of the regulators such as National Hydrocarbon Commission and the Regulatory Energy Commission, as well as the transformation of Pemex and CFE to productive national enterprise. 4, environmental protection and to promote clean energy. And 5, transparency and accountability. Now, what is happening and what is going to happen in the hydrocarbon sector? Well, as I said, the opening in exploration and extraction through contracts, permits, issuing permits on refinery, petrochemicals, distribution, storage. Pemex, as I said, is going to change to a state productive company and will have budget, management, and technical autonomy. we're also going to have an independent operator of the natural gas. It's going to call Senagas. It's going to be the National Center of Control of Natural Gas that will control the pipelines system. And another thing that I want to emphasize is the transparency in all the process. Now, what's going to happen, or what is happening in the electric system? Well, the opening is equal opportunities, because on the opening of generation on electricity, concerning and commercialization, concerning the distribution and transmission, electricity will maintain a strategic area, and CFE will operate and will build the network, but can also have third parties, alliances, and contracts. Also, CFE will transform as a productive national enterprise and will have the same specifications in budget, in autonomy, management, and technical autonomy. And we'll also have an independent operator of the national electricity system. Now, Christian told me to talk about a little bit of the contracts. I don't think I'll have the time, so later if you want to ask the legal framework of the contract. But I want to point a few benefits of this reform. The expectation is that we will lower our prices on electricity and gas after 2 years after the secondary legislation is approved. 2, creation of jobs. Not only on the energy sector. I'm from Baja California, right at the border. When I used to work in a law firm, some of the issues concerning American companies that are at the maquila scenario, manufacturer scenario, is that they want to import energy because the electricity in Mexico, as I said, is more expensive. So when we increase the electricity prices, we're also going to create more jobs, not only in the energy sector, but in the manufacturing sector. So what is the expectation? 500,000 more jobs on 2015 and 2.5 million jobs on 2025. And another expectation is the increase on production on oil for 3.5 million barrels per day in 2025. Now, due to the integration of Congress and that the constitutional reform has passed, and that the constitutional reform involves a qualified quorum of the vote. But the secondary legislation that is discussed as we speak does not require this qualified voting quorum. So it's just a matter of time when this is going to be approved. But our main challenge will be the execution of such legislation based on the best international practice, and of course to develop what the reform is proposing. This policy well integrated based on checks and balance in order to bring certainty to the investments, competitiveness, transparency, of course, lower prices. So with that scenario, we think that Canada and the United States can and will play an important role. Concerning the exchange of technology, sorry, is the time?
Sí, bueno,
Okay.
Depends on us. But let me ask you just a question, and has to do with what you were about to say, I believe, which is timing. I remember very well a speech by President Peña Nieto in September when he said, at most we're going to get into production sharing agreements. Came December, and you went much further than that, passing the licensing. I mean, now private companies can have direct investment in the upstream without partnering with Pemex. You changed the 3 key articles in the Constitution, not just in Congress, but also in the states, and the Constitution has been reformed. You are about, as Christian said in the introduction, to pass the secondary laws. But although what has been done has been humongous, there is a lot to be done yet. I mean, Pemex has relinquished areas for opening those areas to private investment, what you call round zero. You need to, it has been created, but to nourish the regulatory agency, Comisión Nacional de Hidrocarburos, that is the institution that will open for bidding the land, the oil-bearing lands in Mexico, and that will take time. Then the issue of time is important here. I'll give you a reference. The legal reform in Colombia was in 2003, and production began in earnest in 2008. The scope of that reform was much less than in Mexico, and it took 5 years from the moment they said we're opening to the actual opening and increasing in actual investment in the sector and growing. Then when can we realistically, to the best of your understanding at this moment, expect private investment in the oil sector, in the upstream? When can we expect investment to materialize and production to start coming out of private investment in the oil sector? Give us, as a lawyer, you must know that the devil is in the details. I mean, how you structure the contracts, how you offer that for bidding, and how that materializes.
And I will answer as a lawyer. So as a lawyer, first, we need to the legal framework. The legal framework is not approved. It's being discussed as we speak. But I can sure tell you about certain timing proposals that are based on the initiative. So we need to bear in mind two things. One, as he mentioned, round zero. Round zero, why is it important? And when is the due date? September 16. Established on the constitutional reform that has been approved, Pemex submitted his petition, and after his petition, the Minister of Energy will consider the allocations on exploration area and the field production area through leases. After that, Pemex will know when he can also Pemex also a partnership with third parties. But after that, we expect the bidding round to start on June 15.
Next year.
Next year. So, and now, when, to answer the particular question, when are they going to start not to invest, but to see the results of them? It's a complicated response because it has to do with what are being discussing right now. The process, not only to design the contracts, but how it's going to be the operation of the process, of the bidding process. Of course, we do have the proposal, as Rafael mentioned. Ramon, sorry, Ramon. The National Hydrocarbon Commission is going to be in charge of the bidding rounds. We do have the process, but to answer that particular question on when are going to be we're going to have the exact results, it has to do with what is being discussed right now.
Okay. David, let me ask you about volumes also, to balance the two questions. The bulk of your production, the bulk of the increment in production in Canada is coming from the tar sands.
From the oil sands.
The oil sands. You know, we had the same discussion for years in Venezuela because we refer to the faja bituminosa, the tar belt,
yes,
until we change it to the oil belt. No. The oil belt. Okay, the oil sands. Sorry for that. It's quite inefficient. It's very energy intensive. It has some environmental impacts. But particularly, it's very slow to develop because it's like farming. It's very capital intensive, energy intensive. Then the question is, how do you foresee Canadian production to evolve? You're now at around close to 4 million
Yes.
barrels per day. Are you expecting that production to evolve over the next 10 years or so? Is it all the increment in production coming from the oil sands in Alberta? Are you on the verge of exploring in new areas? How are you expecting those 4 millions to evolve over the next 10 years?
Well, very quickly, there is some East Coast production, which of course is offshore.
That's in the Newfoundland area?
Yes, the Newfoundland area. There's also shale opportunities in the Maritimes and Eastern Canada as well. We've drilled over 8,000 frac wells in Alberta successfully without incident, so there is still growth in the conventional. But a lot of the focus is, in fairness, on the oil sands. But these massive mines, and of course, you know, what really happened here very quickly is that when the environmental community was working hard to price carbon, and the UN, September 23rd UN session on climate change, the focus will be on pricing carbon. And Alberta priced carbon in 2007. We were the first jurisdiction in North America to do so, and there's a $15 charge. But back to your question, a lot of the investment has gone into efficiency. CO2 numbers on a per barrel basis have dropped by 28%. And the technology focused now is on in situ. So where you have these massive mines, the mines only represent less than 15% of the resource. You can only mine the oil sands if the overburden is about 50 feet. Beyond there, it gets more difficult. Part of the technology boom was going from these massive diggers, drag lines we call them, to the truck and shovel method, so that you would only produce the stuff which is richer in oil. Now, what in situ does, it's very simple. And the original version was you pumped a lot of hot steam into the ground and warmed the reservoir, because this stuff is peanut butter. You know, this is not, the issue we have on rails and rail safety is a very light oil coming from the Bakken. It vaporizes. The oil from Alberta, the heavy oil from Mexico, from Venezuela, from Alberta, it doesn't move on its own. You have to warm it. So what we're doing now is you run a steam pipe in, you warm the formation, and you simultaneously pull it out. So the CO2 numbers have dropped dramatically. The cost of production has dropped dramatically. Exxon Imperial is opening a new mine, Kearl, and Kearl will now have equivalent CO2 numbers to conventional. So I think there's been a dramatic improvement both in terms of CO2 intensity and also in terms of cost. So the big focus in oil everywhere is cost. So yes, I do see a lot of the increased production coming from offshore Newfoundland, coming from the oil sands, some from conventional, but it's coming not from these massive mines, it's coming from the tremendous growth in situ, which is a very small footprint, and it's a much more efficient and less capital-intensive way of producing.
For which you have benefited from the Venezuelan diaspora. A number of technical people that was developing the belt moved to Canada.
Oh, absolutely, and I think that's the big interest we have in Mexico, of course, is I don't know when the big operators, I mean, I think Mexico needs to do this because of the complexity of the formations, because of the technology that's required, and there's tremendous technological skills, as you say, in Venezuela and Alberta, and so there's a big opportunity for the production sector. But my frustration over the Keystone discussion is that imports from Venezuela have gone from 1.5 million down to 800,000 barrels a day. And that's because that oil is going to China. They owe $40 billion up until last week, and last week another $4 billion was loaned to Venezuela. And I'm pointing to Ramon because, of course, he is a former officer at PDVSA, so I'm trying to get him going. But so Mexico has declined its imports because you've got some plumbing issues, and Venezuela has chosen other markets because they have a big commitment to repay some of that debt with oil. So, of course, the need for that heavy oil is coming. The need it will be served by Alberta, joined by Mexico as you ramp back up with these reforms. That's my thought. But I see Venezuela trying to increase its production to meet its international commitments.
Just one more question to each one on my side and then open it. But Hector, since Cantarell began declining around 2006 to 2007, Mexico was producing close to 4 million barrels. It has come down more than 1 million barrels since. um, the Mexican oil current account has been deteriorating, not just because it exporting less oil, crude oil, but because it is importing more products. I mean, you have just one refinery, and then you export a large amount of crude, but also import more expensive amounts of oil products. Then the balance has been, in dollar terms, deteriorating very rapidly. That will not stop in the short run until production picks up. How do you see the macro situation evolving in the meantime, in between? And the key point for me is how to manage expectations. We went through that in La Apertura in Venezuela. And people think that you need just to change the law for things to happen. And there are these big lead times in the oil sector. Then, in the shorter term, the macro situation most probably will keep deteriorating in Mexico. And you had to pass the fiscal reform prior to the oil reform because you had to lower the burden in the oil sector for the investments to materialize, but increase the fiscal burden in the non-oil sector, on the private citizens. Mm-hmm. Then how do you foresee the management of these expectations on the part of the Mexican government?
Well, first of all, the government is well aware of this gap. Mm-hmm. And even though our expectation on our goal are a few years after the legislation is approved, we are well aware that in that period of time, we will have not only technical difficulties, and that the situation maybe is going to decrease. But what the government is expecting is, or what it's doing right now is exactly, it's waiting to the reform to pass, and it's expecting that all the process from day one to the day of when we open it to the bidding round will be successful in order to change that.
Okay. Last question, David. We couldn't escape talking about Keystone XL. I mean,
the most famous pipeline that's never been built.
Okay, well, it seems that it will be finally built. You will be competing, as you said correctly, for deep conversion refining capacity in the Gulf of Mexico area that up to now has been intaking heavy and sour crudes coming from Venezuela and Mexico. Mexico, for technical reasons, Venezuela, for political reasons, have been diminishing their exports to the US, and you're planning to take that spare capacity.
Yes.
But you will have to fight for that market eventually, because Mexico will recover, Venezuela will eventually recover. Then you will be disputing a market that on its own is shrinking, because although out of light oils, US production is increasing and consumption is to increase very slowly. Why don't you, and you having that huge West Coast window, and being close, Alberta, much closer to the West Coast terminals than to the Gulf of Mexico terminal, why don't you look to China or to the Far East for your incremental production? No, I mean, it's very rational. I'm not trying to be nationalistic. No, I'm not, as a matter of fact. But why don't you look to the Pacific or both? I mean, why this, stubbornness that moving south?
Did you hear that, Leo? We're the stubborn ones. Noted, Ramon. All very good points. And of course, the frustration is that members of the Senate have said, well, this is just for export. It's just for, well, in reality, the refining industry is a very different world than the crude industry. And some of that production is refined in the Gulf Coast, and it goes around the world, and that's what happens.
That's correct.
And so, could you say that Alberta is being exported? Not as crude. No, it's being sold to those refineries that will source as you point out, will source all of those regions. Now, you may have a more optimistic view of the recovery of Venezuela in terms of maintaining, but they also have a lot of Citgo refineries, which is the major recipient of their production. So there's that whole issue. Mexico has challenges ahead. I would never say anything negative of Mexico. We're 100% in favor of what you're doing, but time is going to be, we'll be watching that. And in the interim, there's a real market which is now being served by rail. Alberta does have a 4-point strategy. There is an existing pipe to the west coast which has been operating successfully, and Kinder Morgan owns it, and I am optimistic that it will be significantly expanded on a timely basis. Gateway will happen. It may not look like it looks today when it happens, but Gateway is the Enbridge Greenfield project. There are 640 First Nation chiefs in Canada. We are very proud in Canada of how we deal with First Nations. First Nations and their involvement and how they benefit from that project will be a determining factor in terms of when and how it gets done. I do think that that outlet will happen. The East Coast is a much more understandable piece because you're converting a lot of existing gas infrastructure. The Trans-Canada Pipeline is 4 or 5 pipes, not one.
Mm-hmm.
So one will be converted. New Brunswick said can't wait until we get there. The Irving Refinery is one of the largest in North America, 375,000 barrels a day. I was just being beat up in Maine. Maine gets a lot of its oil from the oil sands through the Irving Refinery. So there's also a group in Alaska that would very much like to save the Alaska Pipeline. So they have a vision of railing Alberta production north to the Alaska Pipeline to augment their declines and keep that pipeline flowing. So yes, we're not being piggy here. We just think that market diversity is the correct strategy. We're so over-dependent on the U.S. market now, and I think we're paying a bit of a price.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you for the late arrivals to come, and let's do this as open as possible. Then the floor is open for your questions for the next half an hour or so, 20 minutes. No? There is a question here. Could you please give your name and the rest?
Graham Campbell, Energy Council of Canada. Thank you. Hector, I wonder if you could use your crystal ball and look ahead 5 years and compare and contrast the Mexican energy scene as it exists today with what Mexico's best hopes might be for the electricity scene 5 years out. So let's assume the enabling legislation works its way through, investments start to flow, companies respond, regulations are put in place, everything just goes perfectly as you've conceived. If you look down then on the energy sector in Mexico 5 years out, 2020, what would we see that's different and would fulfill your expectations? And please consider both oil and gas, pipelines, and electricity. And I hope it doesn't use up the next half hour.
Okay. To answer this question, I will first have to talk about what do we have right now approved that has nothing, well, it has to do with the energy reform, but it has to do with the presidential plan. Okay? Now, in the presidential perspective, we have the National Development Program. That from that plan, we have a infrastructure program plan, and from that in infrastructure or investment in a program, it is we are going to invest a certain amount of money that the more in the more area in the electricity sector, in hydrocarbons and electricity. Now, how do I see Mexico in 5 years? And I'll try to separate hydrocarbons, natural gas, gasoline. For example, gasoline. Let's talk about gasoline. The expectation of, if everything goes through, in 2016, well, now, what is happening to the gasoline? The only one that can sell gasoline is Pemex. 2016 will open to the private investors and companies, and they can also sell gasoline. In 2017, we're going to open the importation of gasoline, and in 2018, we're going to free the gasoline price. That is what's going to happen with gasoline. So we expect to lower the price in gasoline. Now, as I mentioned before, we do have an infrastructure program that contemplates 600 billion pesos in energy infrastructure. And as we speak, for example, we are developing two power plants up north in Sonora, in Guaymas, of an investment of $2.6 billion. So even though that we need to wait for the reform, we do have a specific program in infrastructure concerning hydrocarbons and electricity. And in the hydrocarbon sector, it's about $3 trillion what we expect to invest. Now, on clean energy, where do we see ourselves in 5 years? We do have, as I said, a national program and specific programs that has to do with the development of clean energy. And we also have an act that to the use of energy renewable sources. And we have expectation, we have goals. As I know we have goals, and sometimes it's difficult to get to that, but as a government, that's what we're trying to do to implement in order to get to that goal. So the goals in energy sources, I will go not 5 years, but in 2024, we expect that the sources of natural gas, of renewables will be 35% of the whole market. What's going to happen with natural gas? Natural gas, it's not going to be by decree. It's a logic equation that has to do when we open the sector. So in 2015, we'll open the sector bidding round, and as we have more investment in natural gas, and I think we will import less natural gas, so the price will increase. It's not, for example, it's not a matter of electricity installation. In Mexico, for example, let me give you an interesting fact. The day that the World Cup inauguration is the day that we consumed the more electricity in the history. Not when we lost against Holland. It wasn't a penalty, by the way. But we used 43,000 megawatts. Now the capacity in our country, it's 43,000 megawatts. It's not a problem of infrastructure, of installation, of energy capacity. It's a problem of how are we getting the energy. So in electricity, as we use 80% of the cost of the energy is based on the fuel we use. Now, fuel is 4 times more expensive than natural gas and more pollutant. So the challenge here is to change to replace with natural gas, which is 4 times cheaper and less pollutant. So that's how I see with cheaper electricity tariffs.
Questions? Yes, 1, 2, 3. Okay.
My name is Brian Scheid. I'm a reporter with Platts. I had a question regarding these recent condensate rulings that have come out of Commerce. There's debate over whether or not that's actually shows a sign that the Obama administration is willing to loosen its export policy. But I was wondering from Canada and Mexico's standpoint, what's sort of the best case scenario? How would your countries benefit the most from any change or no change in export policy? You know, if there is no change, maybe there's, you know, a change within the U.S. refining sector, which would limit demand for Canadian and Mexican oil. I mean, I'm just speculating there, but just wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, if I can just touch on that. We're well aware that there's a tremendous demand in Asia, and also, of course, some in Alberta as well. There's a great demand for condensate, so there's a great deal of logic to that. We also know that a lot of the push or a lot of the political engagement, and I'm not speaking from knowledge here, I understand that a lot of the political engagement is coming out of the Bakken because there's a lot of lighter oils. Canada is a trading nation, you know, be it agricultural, be it mining, be it electricity. I mean, we just produce far more of everything than we can possibly consume. So any Canadian position on trade is going to be pro-trade. I mean, I came down here to work on the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement 100 years ago, and that's and that saga continues. So the Canadian position, I believe, Paul, the Alberta position, the industry position is that we support exports. We just think that markets work. So that's always going to be in our position. And we've heard lots of discussion around molecules. I mean, condensate is a form of oil. It's the lighter end of the spectrum. So we just, our official position is that exports make sense. It's been a great boon to the refining industry to export product. It also has helped. I mean, Europe has been short of low sulfur diesel, so you've had low sulfur diesel going in that direction. There hasn't been a new refinery built in a long time, but I made the mistake of saying that in front of the EIA the other day, and he pointed out that his axe at home is his father's axe. It's got 2 new heads and 3 new handles. So there's been a lot of investment in refining capacity, upgrading. But the reality of it is there's just great logic in terms of the trade and energy.
The gentleman there. Yeah.
Paul Connors, Canadian Embassy. Thank you both for your presentations. Hector, prior to NAFTA, several sectors were closed in Mexico to outside investment, mining, oil and gas are two. Mexico chose in the NAFTA negotiations not to derogate on mining. The mining sector was open. Previously, you had Grupo Mexico and Peñoles dominating the sector. Since it opened, the sector has grown exponentially, mainly from Canadian and U.S. investment. The story is different on oil and gas side. So question, now that you're opening up the oil and gas sector to investment, is there any thinking in Mexico about revisiting the NAFTA treaty and to remove your derogation from the Chapter 6 is the energy chapter, which Mexico is mainly derogated from. Is there any thinking to undo that derogation?
Sure. Well, concerning the mining industry, it is going to change a few things, but it will benefit also the mining industry. There's going to be certain particularities on the concession granted on mining, but it will maintain the concessions granted, and the rules will benefit everything or any the mining industry. So I don't know if I respond.
Is there any thinking to change your derogation? Right now, Chapter 6 of NAFTA on energy does not apply to Mexico. Are you thinking about changing that?
I will have to get back to you on that one.
Okay. Good.
Solomon Kalich, Management Global Strategies. Thank you for your lecture today. Hector, when you talk about the bidding rounds for June 2015, does that refer to what is known or what is being referred to as round 0.5, where Pemex would be able to partner with private companies for developing their assignments? Or would it entail new fields, new contracts and licenses for other areas for private sector players? And if so, if it's round 1, would Pemex be allowed to participate in round 1?
Okay.
Thanks.
The answer would be no, it's not the same. The round 1.5 is precisely what you said. It's pen mixed with third parties. And round one, the bidding round on June 15, it will be open to everyone. Now, who will define the areas? The Ministry of Energy, based on what happened in round 0. So the areas will be defined by the Ministry of Energy. He's the one who, the Ministry of Energy will also provide the guidelines of the contracts. And after that, as I said, the Hydrocarbon Commission will be in charge of the allocation of the bidding process. He's the one who's gonna sign the contract.
Just a quick follow-up. It will be both oil and gas? That be
Oil and gas,
round
yes.
one? It will be both?
Well, as I said, the Ministry of Energy will establish the main areas.
areas.
We don't exactly know.
We have 10 more minutes, then we have a space for, 10, I'm the moderator.
And the host.
Diana
This is your room.
Diana Negroponte, Brookings Institution. Hector, going back to the relationship with NAFTA. National content rules are within NAFTA prescription. The PEMEX opening and its allowance of a 25% national content moving up to 35% content are, in many opinions, in contradiction, violate the NAFTA. How are you going to reconcile?
Sorry,
NAFTA does not allow national content. The reform allows national content.
okay.
How do you resolve?
Well, what we are proposing right now concerning the national content, and the percentage is not being approved. So what you're saying is only a proposal. It will be, I will have to answer that after we approve the secondary legislation.
David? Questions? No? David Maris, no? One more question before we, yes, here.
Good morning. My name is Mark Hutter, and I'm with Michaels Corporation, where he would be the lead contractor for Keystone XL, should it go through. One of the issues that we work with, and we have a wonderful relationship with many companies in Canada, is the transportation of labor and the labor shortages that are experienced in the energy sector. Is the energy ministry working to try and help that? Because I know that there are challenges with the labor component.
I think that's a very good point, and that point is identified.
It is a key point.
Yeah, it's a key point, and of course, part of it is the specialized skills that are required. Part of it is the aging workforce. Part of it is cost. The industry is very focused on cost, and of course, the intensity of the development is what drives a lot of those labor shortage concerns. We also, you may be aware of this, there's been a few political issues which have arisen around your project. And one of the things that we talk about is the opportunity for infrastructure which is in fact funded by shareholders as opposed to funded by governments. The beauty of pipelines is that unlike bridges and roads, they don't increase the debt. They tend to pay good taxes. They don't require a lot of schools or garbage pickup. It's a great opportunity for local communities, and it also happens to be a preferred mode of moving energy. The labor issue is something that we have addressed, obviously, in Canada, because it trickles through the entire economy. We have the oil sands as the largest employer of indigenous peoples, probably in the world, but certainly in North America. We have really developed our school infrastructure, our technical infrastructure for training purposes. We have a dream that returning veterans who have a lot of skills that are applied or applicable, a way to fast track their credentials in terms of of union tickets and in terms of trade credentials. We think that that's an effort. It's an effort, it's a discussion that goes on between Canada and the U.S. We think that that should be ramped up. So there are returning vets who are not fully employed. So there are a number of aspects to this. They're all upside in terms of opportunity, but you're right, it's a very real issue because when you have the major capital investment, and Mexico, it's going to be a bit of time. We have an immediate concern right now because, of course, that's a cost driver. All I can tell you is that when you talk to the industry, cost is a significant concern. CO2 reduction and research into climate is a major issue. But in those top 2 or 3 issues that they face, we know we don't have finding costs in Alberta. We know where the resource is. We know what technologies work. So COSIA is a fascinating example of 13 companies that are pooling their intellectual property, not on competitive issues in terms of price of the resource, but competitive issues in terms of water and air and environmental protection. So there's been over $1 billion of technology shared just responding to environmental issues. And of course, part of that includes the sharing. GE is a major contractor. There's now a water utility. So all of that reduces your demands for labor. There's a great deal of efficiency being driven into the industry, but that remains the issue. And the irony of it is, there's a lot of pressure on law schools right now because we're good for lawyers. We're a little short of engineers.
Yeah, just to close, I mean, there is a study by Arnold Falkenberg Jr. at Schlumberger Services making a worldwide analysis of supply and demand of skilled labor in the oil and gas industry and the huge bottleneck that is developing in that supply that will most probably push wages up. And with luck, the petroleum engineers will earn perhaps 20% what a good baseball player makes.
That's true. Well,
that's a hope.
If I could tell you one very quick story, we brought down the leaders of the procurement officers of the oil sands. 8 companies participated. We had a big meeting in Buffalo. 230 people showed up. And they're now actually, this is 6 months ago, there's actually contracts signed. Buffalo is now providing valves and IT to the oil sands that wasn't happening a year ago. Then we went on from there by van to Cleveland. 10 inches of snow overnight, we still had 135 people come. Same result. We've got companies in Cleveland that are actually supplying the oil sands. So sitting in the bar that evening with the procurement officer from one of the major companies who had initially been a corporate secretary for Google in the Caymans. She got a little lonely down there. She applied online out of university. She was 22, 23. She signed on with Suncor, wound up working in Fort McMurray. She was shopped out of Suncor by a headhunting firm to go to another competitor. She was down there representing one of the majors, and she was signing up this procurement. She's bought her house in Calgary near Exxon's new campus, or Imperial's new campus. Her concern that night was it was her 30th birthday. Yeah. So that's what's going on. I mean, the millennials who have now figured this out, they're not lining up for law school.
Thank you very much. And this has been, I like it, an excellent panel. And I ask you a round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you, Ramon. Appreciate it very much. Great for this.